of the talk, I'm going to be talking about Russian heritage language in 5 different countries, focusing on grammatical gender. Now, the data come from 5 different but comparable studies in 5 different countries: Norway, Germany, Latvia, Israel, and the UK. Now, this is work that has been going on, has been taking place over the last couple of years with several colleagues. And here are my co-authors, Tanja Kupisch in Konstanz, Natalia Mir at Bar-Ilan, and then 3 colleagues from here from Tromsø, Natalia Mitrofanova, Julia Rodina, and Olga Urek. Just realized that they all have Russian names. All right, so here's an overview of the talk. The main questions that I will be dealing with are the following. So, are heritage children sensitive to cues for grammatical gender, or are they just learning gender item-based? We know that that's possible from languages that don't have any gender cues. And what internal and external factors play a role for the acquisition of this complex category? So I'll be talking about gender in Russian, previous research, give you the research questions, and then have a look at the current studies. I'll focus on 2 experiments with real nouns and also nonce nouns in 5 populations. So heritage children in the 5 countries that I already mentioned. And then, of course, results and summary at the end. So first of all, what is grammatical gender? Now, we define gender as agreement between a noun and other targets. For example, determiners or adjectives and even verbs. So here's an example from Norwegian. Day is a masculine noun. So the determiner and the adjective agree with the masculine noun, so it's en fin dag. But house is neuter, so therefore the determiner and the adjective are different, et fint hus. Now, gender is a really complex category across languages. It involves phonology, morphology, and semantics. And there's also a lot of variation across languages with respect to the number and type of gender classes, the transparency of gender assignment, and relation to other properties. So it can be linked with case or definiteness and also other properties. Now, how do children acquire this complex category when they have to learn 2 languages and perhaps 2 different gender systems? Now, in a project called Microvariation in Multilingual Acquisition and Nutrition Situations, which has been running for a few years here in Tromsø, we have done several studies on grammatical gender. We have looked at heritage Russian in Norway, where we have looked at the children's Russian as well as their Norwegian. Heritage Russian in Germany, where we have also looked at both their Russian and their German. Heritage Russian in the UK, we only looked at their Russian because English doesn't have gender. And then there are 2 other studies that have not been part of the MIMS project. That is Heritage Russian in Israel and Russian in Latvia. I'm not sure we can call Russian in Latvia a heritage language. We'll come back to that. Actually, in this next slide. So Russian as a heritage language in these 5 countries. In 4 of them, we're talking about relatively recent immigration. And if we look at the size of the community, we can see that in Norway, it's relatively small. It's a little over 20,000 people speaking Russian as a heritage language in Norway. In Germany, it's a lot bigger, 1.4 million. And it's actually 6.6% of the immigrant population. In Israel, it's even bigger. It's 15% of the total population. And in the UK, the community is small again. It's only 0.12% of the population. Now, Latvia is different because there we have a much more long-term Russian presence from the 19th century. And in fact, in 2013, in the overall total population, Russian speakers made up 26% of that population. And in the capital, Riga, 50% of the population are speakers of Russian. Okay, let's have a look at the gender in Russian. So Russian has a 3-gender system with masculine as the most frequent and also argued to be the default gender, feminine, and then neuter, which is by far the least frequent gender of the 3. Now, Russian doesn't have articles, but gender is marked on adjectives, and they are bolded here because we look at adjectives in our study. They're also marked on demonstratives and possessives, as we see in these examples here. So my large car, car is masculine. So we see masculine agreement on the possessive and the adjective. And then B and C are examples of feminine, of masculine and neuter. Did I say that car was masculine? It's feminine, right? All right. One very important aspect of Russian gender is that it is mostly transparent. That is, the grammatical gender of a noun is predictable from its shape, that is, its ending. And Russian also has very few rules, basically 3 rules, that can account for the majority of nouns, I think more than 90% of the nouns in the language. And those 3 rules are, if a noun ends in a consonant, it's masculine, as we see in the first cell here in the table. If it ends in a, it's feminine, and if it ends in o, it's neuter. But like most systems, there are exceptions, and we have some ambiguous classes. So if a noun ends in a palatal consonant, it can be either masculine or feminine, as we see in the 2 blue cells here. And if a noun ends in an unstressed O, that sounds like a schwa, then it is ambiguous with the feminine. So if it ends in schwa, we don't know if a noun is feminine or neuter. Some previous research, we know that in monolingual acquisition of Russian gender, gender is acquired relatively early, for the transparent masculine and feminine nouns, typically before the age of 3. But we see non-target consistent production with the ambiguous nouns up until age 7. And what we typically see then is that with those that are ambiguous between masculine and feminine, so the ones that end in a palatal, they are typically, masculine is typically overgeneralized to those nouns, whereas feminine is overgeneralized to nouns that are ambiguous between feminine and neuter. Remember that neuter is very infrequent in Russian. Now, what about bilinguals learning Russian gender? Well, learning gender, sorry. It has been argued that there can be cross-linguistic influence across 2 languages for gender, but it's typically manifested as either acceleration or delay, which is caused by variation with respect to the number of genders and the type of gender. So do both languages have neuter, for example, as well as the frequency and transparency of the assignment rules. So for example, Kalsa and colleagues found when they compared Greek German and English German children, that the Greek German children were better and earlier with German gender because they have gender in Greek. That's the argument. But the question is, if there is some kind of transfer from Greek into German, what is it that these kids are transferring? Is it item-based knowledge, that if it has the same gender in Greek and in German, then it's easier? Or is it a semantic category that they know that this must belong to the feminine category? Or is it something else? We'll come back to that. Studies on gender in heritage Russian also exist. Masha Polinsky has a study of adult American Russian heritage speakers from 2008, where she found that the most fluent speakers have an intact three-gender system, but that the less fluent speakers have developed a two-gender system of just masculine and feminine, where all the neuter nouns are analyzed as feminine. So they have a system where if you end in a consonant, you're masculine. If you end in a vowel, either a or o, you're feminine. Julia Rodina and I did a study some years ago where we looked at Norwegian Russian bilingual children, and we found that those children who came from families with two Russian-speaking parents and those that got very consistent input, that is, in families where there was a one parent, one language system, they had a three-gender system intact. But with kids who got mixed input and less input, they preferred to use masculine across the board. In fact, it looked like they were developing a Russian without a gender system at all. So let's go to the current study. First of all, our research questions. First of all, are heritage language children sensitive to gender cues, or do they rely more on lexical knowledge? Presumably, everyone relies a little bit on lexical knowledge, but the question is also, do they rely more than monolingual children on lexical knowledge? Question 2, how does the amount of exposure in the home as well as school affect gender assignment? And is there evidence of cross-linguistic influence? We will use the abbreviation CLI in the next slides, in bilingual acquisition of grammatical gender in Russian. So let's have a look at the language external factors that we have considered. We have considered age, family type, whether both parents were Russian, so it's a heritage Russian family, or whether it's a mixed family. Kindergarten start, when do kids start going to kindergarten? In Norway, for example, they start early, around age 1. In Germany, they start later, typically around age 3. The size of the heritage Russian community, and we saw earlier that the communities are the size of those Russian communities are very different in the countries that we are considering. Current exposure to heritage Russian instruction in school, the main language of instruction, is it bilingual or is it mainly the majority language, and the age of onset of acquisition of the majority language. For language internal factors or cross-linguistic influence, we compare Russian to the 5 languages that it is in contact with in all these cases. Norwegian, German, English, Hebrew, and Latvian. And we might predict, as has been found in previous studies, that the gender system plays a role, the gender system of the majority language, and very often the dominant language of the children. So we might expect cross-linguistic influence from German because German, like Russian, has a 3-gender system. On the other hand, we could expect facilitative influence from both Norwegian and German because those 2 languages have a neuter gender, just like Russian does, but the other languages don't. And then transparency could play a role. Norwegian has very low transparency. You basically have to learn gender in Norwegian item by item. German has medium transparency, but Hebrew and Latvian have very high transparency. So we might expect transparency to play a role in Hebrew and Latvian to be facilitative. Let's have a look at the participants in all these studies. As I said, they are separate studies, but they are also comparable. So if we look at countries first and the number of participants we have, in Germany we have 70, in Israel 42, in Latvia 23, in Norway 55, and 19 in the UK. The age is more or less the same in these in all countries. So from a little over 5 up to 10. And here you can also see in the table what other information we have about them. So age of onset to majority language, current exposure to heritage Russian instruction, community size, main language of instruction, and family type. Now, let's have a look at the experiments that we did. We exposed these children to 30 familiar Russian nouns denoting everyday objects. We used 6 experimental conditions. That is, we used the 3 transparent cues, but we also used ambiguous cues. So we see in the table, masculine transparent ending in a consonant, feminine transparent ending in a, neuter transparent ending in o, and then the opaque or ambiguous nouns that is ending in a palatalized consonant, that's the masculine and feminine opaque, and then neuter opaque that is ending in a ending in schwa. We also used nouns. Then we had not 30, but 25, because we only have 2 ambiguous conditions. These were created by using phonological corpus tools, and we made sure that these nouns didn't have any phonological neighbors and didn't form minimal pairs with existing nouns. So again, we have the 3 transparent cues. We have punip and kluva and garpo. I can say these words in Russian since they aren't real words. Where we predict masculine, feminine, and neuter, respectively. And then we have ending in schwa, where we would expect feminine, but maybe neuter. And ending in a palatalized consonant, where we expect masculine, but maybe also feminine. Now, these nouns were presented with imaginary objects, and here is the methodology or the procedure. We showed the kids 2 items on the screen, and the procedure was the same also with the real words, but then they saw real things. These are the nonce items. And we asked, what do you see? Well, we gave them the word, punip, for example, and we asked the kids to give us the color. So they were supposed to say a blue punip and a golden punip. And then one item disappears and we ask which one disappeared, and we get a 3rd example with an adjective and a noun. So first of all, let's have a look at sensitivity to cues. And there I'm not going to look at all 5 studies. I'm just going to look at the German study because there we compare with monolinguals. And this is based on a paper that is now under revision. Just some background about that study. We have 107 L1 controls, and in fact those were used for all the studies. We have 50 heritage children with 2 Russian-speaking parents and 20 with 1 Russian-speaking and 1 German-speaking parent. And here we see the results of the real nouns I'm sorry, there's quite a bit of information here, but the first two sets of columns are masculine nouns, masculine masculine transparent and masculine ambiguous. The two middle ones are feminine, and the last two are neuter. What we find is that masculine is at ceiling, whether it is transparent or ambiguous. They're a little lower with the neuters. The neuters are infrequent, so there's no difference between transparent and ambiguous. But in the feminines, we do see a difference between ambiguous and transparent, which indicates that they are sensitive to cues. If we look at the nouns, we see that even more clearly. Here we have, I have to think. We have the masculine nouns first, with monolinguals, the Russian, the heritage kids with 2 Russian-speaking parents, and the ones with 1 Russian-speaking parent. Then we have the feminines and the neuters, all 3 transparent ones, and then we have the ambiguous cues towards the end. So the 6 last columns are the ambiguous cues. And maybe it gets a little bit easier here to see. With the ambiguous cues, with the transparent cues, we see that for the neuters, which are, that's the hardest nouns, they typically do masculine agreement with the neuters, not feminine, which is what Masha Polinsky found. We have actually consistently found overgeneralization to masculine in these cases. And surprisingly, with the ambiguous nouns, we don't really find masculine for the ones that end in a palatal. We find lots of red here, right? We find feminine. So we decided to have a closer look at the nouns ending in palatals. Because why didn't the kids default to masculine here? And this is work done by Olga Urek. She looked at the nouns in the Russian language that end in a palatalized consonant and found, did a careful study and found that it's not random whether these nouns get masculine or feminine gender. In fact, it's dependent on a number of factors. So the number of syllables, the initial segment, final nucleus, final segment, stress, morphological complexity. So this is a very complex, issue. And what we then found was that 4 of our 5 nouns that ended in a palatal actually cued more for feminine than masculine. That's why we're not getting a masculine default here. So this is very fine-grained information that the kids were sensitive to, but we as linguists didn't know it at the time. And so the monolinguals are clearly sensitive to this. The bilinguals are a little less sensitive, but we do see the same pattern across the 5 nouns also in the bilinguals. All right, let's move on to the larger study and look at internal and external factors in the 5 different countries. And I'm going to show you the results of the real words first, comparison across 5 countries, where we see the 3 transparent cues first, and we see the masculine cues first, transparent and ambiguous, then feminine in the middle, and neuter towards the end. What we see is very similar to what we saw before, and we see similar patterns across all 5 countries, right? That they're great with the masculines, not so great with the neuters, but we see a distinction between transparent and ambiguous in the feminines. So For the internal factors, we find that condition is significant, but country is not significant. That is, the language, their majority language doesn't play a role. Right, I already said that. So what about the external factors? We had 7 different factors, and we found that 4 of them were significant: age, family type, current exposure to Heritage Russian instruction, and size of the Heritage Russian community. We took out Latvia and only compared the 4 countries, and then the size of the community was still marginally significant. Now we move on to the nonce-nouns. And here we see, here we see the 3 transparent cues first. So masculine ending in a consonant, feminine ending in a, neuter ending in o, and then the two ambiguous or opaque cues. Now, if we compare across these 4 countries, we find that all of these heritage children have a high sensitivity to the transparent cues, especially masculine and feminine, but also to some extent the neuter. And they all have similar sensitivities to the ambiguous cues. We do find a few differences between countries in individual conditions, but they don't correspond to what we predicted based on the gender system of the majority language. So we don't really see any cross-linguistic influence. We had expected maybe facilitation from German and Norwegian because 3 gender system and there's neuter, or from Latvian and Hebrew because it's transparent, but we see no such effect. What about the external factors for the nonce-nouns? Again, we find that 4 factors play a significant role here. Age, family type, so age, of course, the older they are, the better they are, the more Russian they have at home, the better they are. Kindergarten start, and importantly for us, for this particular paper, we found high significance for current exposure to Heritage Russian instruction. And that was very nice because this paper was published very recently in Frontiers in Education in a special issue called The Home Language Goes to School. So that indicates that schooling plays a role and literacy presumably then also a great role. But we were a little unhappy about no cross-linguistic influence. We're linguists after all. So what about cross-linguistic influence? So what we found was that the acquisition of Russian gender is not positively or negatively affected by the majority languages in this case, whether the language had gender or not. So in the kids in the UK were no different from the others. The number of genders or the type of genders and even transparency didn't play a role. So then the question is our study just too crude and doesn't measure these fine-grained distinctions that may be there? Or were there simply too many other external factors? Well, actually, we want to argue that gender in Russian has really robust cues, more robust cues than the languages it is in contact with in these 5 cases. So in these cases, or in the case of Russian gender, children don't need any influence from other languages to learn Russian gender. So even heritage language children don't need any extra help because Russian gender is already very transparent system that is relatively easily learnable by itself. But then we had some new questions. Can there ever be cross-linguistic influence for grammatical gender? I mean, gender is typically linked to individual lexical items. So is that something that can transfer from one language to another? Lexical items, after all, have to be learned for your particular language. Or is cross-linguistic influence for gender more indirect? And in that case, could it be the case that there can be cross-linguistic influence in the other direction in these studies? That is heritage Russian influencing the majority languages in these cases? And in order to answer that question, we're going to look at the German-Russian study again. But now we're going to look at what the kids did in German, not in Russian. And this is based on another paper that is under revision. So now we're going to look at German gender very briefly. We did the same or similar study with the same kids testing their German, and we did real and nonce words. Now, gender in German is similar to Russian in that there are 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, but it's very different from Russian with respect to transparency. So there aren't really big gender cues in German. There are tendencies with many exceptions, and there are many tendencies, and each tendency or cue with exception is accounts only for a small group of nouns. So it's not like Russian where you have 3 rules accounting for basically most of the language. Now in our study, we selected the most reliable cues for gender in German, and that is for feminine and the ending in e, for masculine ending in a consonant cluster, in fact also starting with a consonant cluster, so we combined 2 cues there, and for neuter ending in et. So for real nouns, Fahne, Schrank, and Tablett, and for our nonce nouns, Fuchse, Schrump, and Lapet. Now, let's have a look at what the kids did with these cues. We're only going to look at the nonce nouns here. And here, we haven't been quite consistent with the order. We start with feminine gender. So feminine is red, the first 3 columns here. It's the monolingual Germans, the bilingual German Russians with 1 German-speaking parent, and the bilingual kids with 2 Russian-speaking parents. The next 3 columns are masculine, and masculine is blue, and we see that the masculine cue is not very powerful. The feminine cue they're pretty good at, right? Because they, lots of red here, but not that much blue for the masculine cue, and then the neuter cue is turquoise. The last three columns. Now, what we see is that the bilinguals are actually better with the feminine cue than the monolinguals. And they're also better with the masculine cue than the monolinguals, whether they have 1 or 2 Russian-speaking parents. In fact, the ones with 2 Russian-speaking parents are the best ones here. Now, with the neuter, they are a little lower. But there, they produce more masculine. And remember, our neuter cue in German also ends in a consonant. So, what we find is that the Russian heritage children are more accurate both with the feminine, which ends in a schwa, or a vowel, like in Russian, as well as the masculine, which ends in a consonant. They are less accurate with neuter, but our neuter Q also ended in a consonant, so they may be collapsing those two into the same gender category. And the interesting thing here is that the more Russian input they have, the better they are with the German Qs. So the ones with two Russian-speaking parents who get more input in Russian are actually better than the ones who only have one Russian-speaking parent. So we argue that there isn't a direct link between individual lexical items. Of course, that would be impossible with nonce words. And there is no direct semantic link between, say, feminine and feminine in the two languages, or masculine and masculine in the two languages. What the kids are, in a sense, transferring is the sensitivity to a cue, which is more predictable in their heritage language than in their majority language. So they transfer the idea that the ending of a noun must be significant for the category it belongs to. So, to summarize, and I just have one more slide here, go back to the research questions. So what we have found is that bilingual heritage children are highly sensitive to phonological cues, to gender in Russian, even when the cues are ambiguous and fine-grained. There are clear effects of external factors, such as the amount of exposure at home, as well as instruction in the heritage language, which indicates importance of literacy in the heritage language. And we find no effect of cross-linguistic influence from Norwegian, German, Latvian, Hebrew, or English on Russian gender, but we find some cross-linguistic influence from Russian on the other languages, for example, German, due to high reliability and transparency of the Russian cues. And I think this is a nice result and nice evidence to have, so that the next time a politician complains that immigrant children don't speak the majority language well enough, we can show them that for some properties, the heritage children are in fact better than the native children. Thank you.